Hey there everybody, I'm Joe the Disney Guy, and for the past few weeks we've talked about the Disney films that have come out during the wartime era. But I think it's high time that we talk about how the conflict that defined the era, World War II, affected the Disney company as a whole. So with that in mind, it's time that we dive into a long overdue edition of Disney History Lessons. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, lasting from 1939 to 1945 and involving over 100 million people in over 30 different countries. Okay guys, quick rundown of World War II. The war started on September 1st, 1939, when Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland, subsequently starting a war between two different factions: the Axis, which featured Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the Allies, which featured France, Russia, and Great Britain. The US stayed out of the war until December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, prompting the Americans to join the conflict on the side of the Allies. The war in Europe would last until May 8, 1945, when Germany finally surrendered following the fall of Berlin and the death of Adolf Hitler. And the war would last in Japan until August 15, 1945, following the detonation of 2 atomic bombs. Man, I knew that history degree would come in handy one of these days. So pretty much, I look at how World War II affected the Disney company in 3 stages: before the US entrance into World War II, during the US's involvement in World War II, and after the war was ended. So first things first, how did World War II affect an American company before America was technically even entered into it? Well, let's refresh a bit. Snow White was released by Disney in 1937, and as we all know, was a wild success. This caused Walt to begin to expand his company in order to begin to produce more animated feature films. Of course, their next feature, Pinocchio, wouldn't be released until 1940, about 5 months after World War II began. This was a problem because with the war raging on, not only were people in Europe and Asia not exactly lining up to see an animated film, but the European and Asian markets were essentially closed down to American films anyway. To put it in perspective, Snow White made about $7.8 million internationally during its initial run. Pinocchio, on the other hand, made only $1.4 million total in its initial run. So yeah, you could say that the war had a bit of a profound effect on the success of movies during the time period. Disney's next few features didn't fare much better, again due in large part to the closing of foreign markets because of the war, and with his movies struggling at the box office on top of the large expansion of the company, the studio began to enter some dire financial straits. Now, bear in mind that just because the US hadn't actually entered World War II doesn't mean that they weren't involved. The US understood the threat of Nazi Germany and attempted to hinder its influence in places like Latin America, and one of the ways they did that was by turning to Walt Disney. We've talked at length about Disney's goodwill tours through South America, so you can check those out at these links. But now let's get to the bulk of Disney's involvement in World War II, which came after the US officially joined the conflict. Really, Disney's involvement in the war effort started in 1942, when the Navy approached Walt with a request to make 900,000 feet of film for their men, about 153 hours worth, in order to educate the sailors on navigation tactics. Following this, other branches of the military, such as the Army and the Air Force, also began to request for educational films from Disney, and before long, Disney Studio essentially had the look of a military base of sorts. Even government departments, such as the Department of Agriculture and the Treasury Department, seeing the success and influence of Disney's films, began to request for movies of their own to show the public, in order to strengthen home morale and support of the war effort. In fact, 37% of people admitted in a Gallup poll that a Disney film, The Spirit of 43, played a factor in their willingness to pay taxes. I don't know what was more shocking, that 37% of people paid their taxes because of a Disney movie, or that 37% of people admitted that they paid their taxes because of a Disney movie. Probably the thing that Disney is most remembered for in terms of World War II, however, was their propaganda films. Much of Disney's production of propaganda began in 1942, when filmmaker turned colonel Frank Capra asked Disney to provide animation for his Why We Fight film series, originally intended for troops but soon released to the public due to their popularity. Then there was Victory Through Air Power, which was made at the request of Major Alexander de Seversky, and basically was about de Seversky's theories about the benefits of long-range strategic bombing. The US government also requested a multitude of propaganda films and posters from Disney, portraying anti-German and anti-Japanese sentiments in order to show the American public that the countries they were fighting were without morals. Overall, Disney produced over 400,000 feet of film for the war effort, and while that figure doesn't match even half of the Navy's initial request, it's still over 68 hours of continuous film, which really is an incredible figure when you consider that at the time, Disney was only accustomed to making about 28,000 feet of film per year. Film wasn't the only way that Disney was featured in the war, however. Following the popularity of an unlicensed war insignia of Mickey riding a goose, another name for a bomber plane, tons of other units began to request Disney insignias of their own. Just about every character in the Disney library, aside from Bambi, was used in these insignias, but the most popular character by far was Donald Duck. Partially due to his overall popularity and partially due to the fact that he had always been portrayed as a sailor anyway, Donald really became the face of Disney's war effort. He appeared on countless insignias, as well as just about all of Disney's most popular propaganda films, such as Donald Gets Drafted, Commando Duck, and Der Fuhrer's Face. Interestingly enough, you really don't see Disney's mascot, Mickey Mouse, in a lot of these shorts. Though I can't exactly confirm it, I have to imagine it's because the company didn't want Mickey, who they had been pushing as a role model and really the face of the company, associated in any way with Nazis or war. Bear in mind, of course, that despite all of this work for the war effort, Disney still had a company of his own to run, and the war heavily affected that as well. Obviously the financial squeeze was still there, but Disney also began losing a lot of their crew to the military. In response to this, Disney had to release films that could be made quickly and cheaply, which is why the compilation films that we've been looking at became popular at the studio, and it also led to the release of The Reluctant Dragon. Disney also began their tradition of re-releasing old films, beginning with Snow White in 1944, as a way to reintroduce the films to a new generation and to bring in some much-needed cash without having to spend almost anything. The end of the war in 1945 didn't necessarily end the war's effect on the Disney studio. Though the requests from the government finally stopped, many of Disney's problems, primarily the financial ones, were still highly prevalent. This is why Disney continued to release compilation films all the way until 1949. Disney also began to produce more live-action films at this time, as they were cheaper and faster to make, highlighted by the release of The Song of the South in 1946. Merchandising also took off during this time period as a way to make back money, and aided by an incredibly successful 1947 and the return of many of his artists, Disney was finally able to begin production on a full-length animated feature in Cinderella, taking Disney out of the wartime era at last. Overall, many of the films produced and released by Disney during World War II are fascinating to look at. Though some are obviously more serious in tone, many of them still have a distinct Disney flavor to them, even despite the subject matter. And really, it was probably thanks to these propaganda films that the Disney company was even able to survive World War II. So although World War II was certainly a somber chapter in world history, it definitely is one of the more unique chapters in Disney's. Well guys, that about wraps it up for me this week. Look, there is so much more that we can talk about this era in Disney history, and one of these days I do want to get to all the different shorts of the wartime era because they really are just fascinating to look at. I hope you all enjoyed the episode, and let me know what you think, both about the episode and about this time period in Disney history. Make sure you subscribe to my channel, check out last week's video, next week's video, and if you like this episode, check out the last Disney history lesson. And I'll see you all next week.
It's a great disgrace, so be heil, heil, right in the Führer's face.